I was eating cereal over my kitchen sink on an ordinary Tuesday morning when a notification popped up on my phone from a DNA testing site I'd used 2 years earlier, mostly out of curiosity. Mostly because a coworker had gifted everyone in the office a kit as a holiday joke that turned into an actual hobby for half of us. The notification said, "You have a new close family match, Ren Castillo, estimated relationship, sister full or half." I remember setting my spoon down very carefully, like the sound of it clinking against the bowl might somehow make the message less real. I have one sibling, my older brother Marcus, and I have known him my entire life, grown up in the same house, shared the same 2 parents, the same Christmas mornings, the same family arguments about who left the porch light on. There was no version of my family tree that had room in it for a name I'd never heard before. I clicked on her profile. There was a short message attached, sent 4 days earlier, that I'd somehow missed because I never check that app anymore. "Hi Naomi, this is going to sound strange and I've rewritten this message about 6 times, but the site is showing us as an extremely high match for half-siblings, and I think I need to ask you something. Does the name Richard Calloway mean anything to you?" Richard Calloway is my father's name. I sat down on my kitchen floor, cereal forgotten, and read that sentence 4 more times because the first 3 times my brain simply refused to connect it to anything real. My father is 61 years old. He coaches Little League on weekends. He falls asleep in his recliner every night by 9:30 watching the same 3 channels on rotation. He is, as far as I have known for 31 years, an unremarkable, steady, faithful man who has been married to my mother for 34 years. I remember the specific, small details of that morning with a clarity that still surprises me. The cereal going soggy in the bowl on the counter, the tile floor cold through my pajama pants, the sound of my downstairs neighbor's television bleeding faintly through the wall, ordinary noises continuing on exactly as they had 5 minutes earlier, as if the entire foundation of my family hadn't just quietly shifted underneath me. I kept looking at my phone screen and then looking away, like it might somehow resolve itself into something less complicated if I just gave it enough time. If you're watching this right now, I want you to think for a second about a name from your own family, a parent, a grandparent, someone you thought you knew completely, and imagine seeing it appear on your phone screen from a total stranger. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I think a lot of you are about to feel exactly what I felt sitting on that kitchen floor. I messaged Ren back within the hour. Her reply came almost instantly, like she'd been waiting by her phone, and it contained the second shock of that morning, the one that turned this from a strange coincidence into something I couldn't put back in the box no matter how badly, in that moment, I wanted to. I was adopted at birth through a private agency in Ohio 30 years ago. My non-identifying file has always listed the biological father's occupation as insurance adjuster and his approximate age at the time. I looked up your dad's LinkedIn after we matched. He was an insurance adjuster in Ohio 30 years ago. I think he might be my father too, Naomi. I think we might be sisters. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed running through 31 years of memory, looking for cracks I might have missed, an unexplained absence. A strange phone call, an argument between my parents that never got fully explained. I couldn't find anything. That was almost worse than finding something would have been. It meant whatever this was, it had been hidden well enough that I'd never had a single reason to suspect it. I called my mother the next morning, my hands unsteady around the phone the entire time. I didn't lead with an accusation. I asked carefully, the way you'd approach something fragile, whether she knew anything about a woman named Ren Castillo. There was a silence on the line that told me everything before my mother said a single word. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, and her voice had gone strange and flat, stripped of its usual warmth. "She found me through a DNA site. She thinks Dad is her biological father. She was adopted at birth 30 years ago through an agency in Ohio." The silence this time lasted so long I checked to see if the call had dropped. "Your father made a mistake a long time ago," my mother finally said. "Before you were born, it was handled. It was a closed chapter and it was going to stay a closed chapter, and I need you to understand that bringing it back up now serves absolutely no one." "Mom. She's my sister. She is a stranger," my mother said, sharper now. "A stranger who happens to share some DNA with your father. That doesn't make her family, Naomi. Family is the people who raised you, who showed up for you, who built a life alongside you. It's not a percentage on a website. I sat with that sentence for a long time after we hung up, because I understood, even in the moment, that my mother believed every word of it, and I understood just as clearly that believing something doesn't make it true. Ren hadn't asked to be born into secrecy. She hadn't asked to spend 30 years without a single answer about where she came from. Calling her a stranger felt like exactly the kind of sentence someone builds when they need permission to keep hiding something. I called my father that evening. He was quieter than my mother had been, which somehow felt worse. I always wondered if this day would come, he said finally. I'm not proud of what happened, Naomi, but it was handled. Your mother handled it. What does handled mean, Dad? He didn't answer that question. Not that night, and I'd learn over the following months, not honestly for a long time after. I want to tell you about the moment this stopped being a conversation and started being an investigation. Because it happened almost by accident, 3 weeks later. When I drove to my parents' house to help my mother clean out the garage for an estate sale she'd been planning for months. Unrelated to any of this, just an ordinary chore between a mother and daughter on an ordinary Saturday. There was an old metal file box in the back corner of the garage, behind a shelf of paint cans, the kind of box people use for tax documents they're supposed to shred but never quite get around to. My mother told me to leave that one, just old receipts, nothing worth going through, and normally I would have believed her without a second thought. But something in the careful, deliberate way she said it made me wait until she'd gone inside to refill our water bottles, and then I opened it anyway. Most of it really was old receipts, exactly like she'd said, faded grocery slips and utility bills from decades ago that nobody in their right mind would keep. But near the bottom, in a manila envelope separate from everything else, I found a stack of canceled checks, rubber-banded together, dated across almost 11 years, each one written out to the same name. Deborah Ashcroft. The amounts varied, sometimes $200, sometimes $500, once oddly exactly $1,200. But they arrived with unsettling regularity, roughly every 2 months for over a decade. My mother's signature was on every single one. I sat on the cold garage floor with those checks spread out in front of me, doing math in my head. Deborah Ashcroft. I didn't recognize the name from anywhere in our family, but something about the pattern, regular, quiet, deliberate, hidden in a box my mother specifically told me not to open, made my stomach turn before I'd even fully processed what I was looking at. I noticed something else too once I laid the checks out in order by date. The very first one, the oldest, was dated almost exactly 9 months before my own birthday. I sat with that detail for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest, because it meant whatever arrangement this was hadn't started as a distant reaction to old history. It had started right around the time my mother would have been pregnant with me, meaning she'd learned about this, and begun quietly managing it, at almost the exact same time she was preparing to bring me into the world. I've thought about that overlap more than almost anything else in this entire story. She'd carried both secrets at once, for months, and chosen to let only one of them become a person she'd raise in the open. I photographed every check on my phone before my mother came back outside. That night, I searched the name and found a public records match for a Deborah Ashcroft who had lived, 30 years ago, in the same small Ohio town where my father had worked as an insurance adjuster. The same town, the same window of time, the same profession Ren's adoption file had described. I texted Ren that night with the photos. Her response came back within minutes. That's her. That's my birth mother's name. I have it on my original adoption paperwork. Ren and I started talking regularly after that, carefully at first, the way you'd approach anything this fragile, but with a growing, undeniable pull that surprised me every time we hung up the phone. We were both nervous about it feeling forced, about performing a closeness neither of us actually felt yet, but instead we kept finding small, strange overlaps that felt like evidence of something even before the paperwork ever confirmed it. We both hated cilantro. We'd both broken the same wrist, the left one in almost the same way, falling off a bike at around the same age. She laughed exactly like my father laughed, a short surprised bark before it settled into something quieter, and the first time I heard her do it over a video call, I had to mute myself for a second because I hadn't expected it to hit me that hard. She told me about growing up in a loving adoptive family 2 states away, good parents who'd always been honest with her about the adoption itself, but who genuinely had no information beyond what the agency's non-identifying summary provided. She told me she'd taken the DNA test 3 years earlier, mostly out of curiosity, and had checked it maybe twice a year since, never expecting a match this close. When my profile appeared, she said she'd stared at her screen for almost 20 minutes before she worked up the nerve to message me. I wasn't trying to blow up anyone's family, she told me once, her voice careful in a way that made it clear she'd rehearsed the sentence. I just wanted to know where I came from. I didn't expect there to be a whole hidden history attached to it. I believed her completely, and I think that belief is part of what made the next several months so hard, because the more I got to know Ren, the more obvious it became that the only person who'd ever framed her as a threat, a stranger, a problem to be managed, was my own mother. Ren had already been through the formal channels years earlier, requesting her non-identifying file from New Beginnings Adoption Services, the small private agency that had handled her placement. What she hadn't tried until now was requesting an updated search. A formal process, she explained, where the agency would attempt to contact the biological parent listed on file to see if they were open to identified contact. She asked me if I thought it was worth trying, given that we already knew who her biological father was. I told her I thought it mattered less for confirming what we already suspected and more for the official record, because something about my mother's file box, hidden in the back of a garage, made me want documentation that existed outside my own family's control. The agency's response took 6 weeks. When it came, it included something neither of us expected. Internal case notes indicating that the agency had, in fact, attempted to make contact with the biological father twice over the years. Once when Ren turned 18, standard procedure at many agencies, and once 11 years before that, when Deborah Ashcroft herself had reached back out to the agency asking whether the birth father's family had ever expressed interest in updates. Both attempts, the notes indicated, had been forwarded through a designated contact number on file, not my father's number, my mother's. I read that detail 3 times before it fully landed. My mother hadn't simply learned about Ren's existence and decided, unilaterally, to keep it from the rest of us. She had, for over a decade, positioned herself as the direct point of contact for any attempt Ren or her birth mother ever made to reach our family, intercepting, redirecting, and ultimately burying every single one, while continuing to write checks to keep the whole arrangement quiet and undisturbed. I didn't go to my mother with this alone. I asked my brother Marcus to come with me, because by that point I'd told him everything, and because some part of me needed a witness who wasn't emotionally tangled up in defending either parent by default. We sat at their kitchen table, the same table I'd eaten breakfast at for 18 years, and I laid out the agency's case notes next to the canceled checks I'd photographed in the garage. My mother's face went very still. "You went through the file box," she said, which was, I noted, not a denial. "You've been the contact for the agency this whole time," I said. "Not Dad, you, for over a decade. Every time Ren or her birth mother tried to reach out, it came to you, and you made sure it never went anywhere." "I was protecting this family," my mother said, and her voice had the same brittle certainty it had carried on the phone weeks earlier. "Your father made a mistake before you were even born. I forgave him. I chose to keep this family together instead of blowing it apart over something that happened decades ago. That woman had no right to keep reaching into our lives every few years and reopening a wound I had already closed. She's not that woman, Mom. Her daughter is my sister." "Your husband's daughter?" My father, who had said almost nothing since we sat down, finally spoke, and what he said surprised me more than anything else that afternoon. "I didn't know she kept reaching out," he said quietly, looking at my mother. "I thought that was settled after the first year. I thought, Linda, you told me she'd stop trying." My mother didn't answer him. I watched something pass between my parents in that silence. 34 years of marriage compressed into a single unspoken argument neither of them was willing to have in front of Marcus and me. And I understood, with a clarity that made me almost sad for both of them, that my mother hadn't just hidden this from Ren and from me. She had, in her own way, been managing my father too, deciding on his behalf, for over a decade, what he was and wasn't allowed to know about his own daughter. Marcus asked the question that none of us had said out loud yet, sitting there at that kitchen table. "Is there a will, a trust, anything that's ever going to have to account for the fact that Dad has 3 kids, not 2? The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. My parents exchanged a look, and my mother's jaw tightened in a way I'd come to recognize over the previous weeks, as the specific expression she made right before offering an answer that was technically true and completely inadequate at the same time. "That's not something we need to discuss right now," she said. "I think it's exactly something we need to discuss right now," I said. "Because if there's a document somewhere that already accounts for this, or specifically doesn't, I want to know before it becomes another thing I find by accident in a box in the garage." My father was the one who finally answered, quietly, almost like a confession he'd been carrying alone for a long time. "There's a life insurance policy," he said. "I updated the beneficiary designation 4 years ago. I added Ren under the name the agency had on file since I didn't know her adoptive name for a 10% share. I never told anyone. I didn't know how to explain it without explaining everything else." My mother looked at him like he'd struck her. "You added her to your policy without telling me?" "I found out where she'd grown up roughly through an old letter Deborah sent years before you started managing all of it," he said, still not quite looking at her. "I never reached out. I was scared to. But I couldn't stand the idea that if something happened to me, she'd get absolutely nothing, not even acknowledgement, after everything that had already been kept from her. It felt like the smallest thing I could do without blowing everything up. It was, I realized later, the first genuinely brave thing I'd ever known my father to do in this entire story, quiet, imperfect, done in secret rather than in the open where it might have actually helped Ren feel less erased, but real nonetheless. He hadn't been as passive as I'd assumed. He'd simply been as afraid of my mother's control as the rest of us apparently had reason to be. I reached out to Deborah Ashcroft directly about 2 months into all of this, with Ren's blessing, because I wanted to understand her side of a story that so far I'd only heard filtered through my mother's checkbook and my father's guilt. Deborah was warm on the phone, older now, her voice carrying the specific gentleness of someone who has made peace with something painful a long time ago but never quite stopped thinking about it. She told me she and my father had a brief relationship decades earlier, before I was born, that ended when he chose to stay with my mother. She told me she'd made the difficult decision to place her daughter for adoption, both because of her own circumstances at the time and because she'd hoped, naively, that it might spare everyone, including me and Marcus, children who didn't exist yet, from a complicated inheritance of secrecy. "I reached out twice over the years," she told me. Once when Ren turned 10 just to ask if the family wanted updated photos, and once when she turned 18, through the agency, hoping maybe by then things had settled enough that contact might be possible. I got a message back both times, through the agency, not directly, saying the family wasn't interested in further contact and asking me not to reach out again. "That message came from my mother," I told her, "not my father. I don't think he ever saw either of your letters." There was a long pause on the line. "I always wondered," Deborah said quietly, "why the tone of those responses felt so different from the man I remembered. He was gentle. Those messages weren't." I asked her carefully what the messages had actually said, and she told me she still had them saved, tucked into an old folder she'd never quite been able to make herself delete. She read me a line from the one sent when Ren turned 18. "The family has no interest in pursuing further contact at this time and requests that no further correspondence be sent. Clinical. Final." Nothing in it that sounded like it had come from a man who, 4 years earlier than that phone call, would quietly add his daughter to his life insurance policy without telling a soul. The checks, it turned out, had been my mother's arrangement entirely. An informal, unspoken agreement, never discussed with my father directly, to keep Deborah financially comfortable enough that she wouldn't feel driven to escalate her requests for contact into something harder to control, like legal action or a more public confrontation. Deborah told me she'd never asked for the money, had in fact tried to refuse it more than once early on, but had eventually accepted it as the only tangible acknowledgement her daughter's existence seemed likely to ever receive from that side of the family. Marcus, ever the practical one, suggested we consult a family law attorney, not to threaten anyone, but because between the life insurance policy, the informal payments to Deborah, and the fact that Ren was, by any legal definition, our father's biological child, there were real institutional questions none of us knew how to answer on our own. The attorney we met with, a calm, unhurried woman named Miss Ockheffer, walked us through it methodically. The life insurance beneficiary designation was legally binding as written, she confirmed, regardless of whether other family members had known about it, my father had every right to name Wren and it would stand. The informal payments to Deborah over the years, while unusual, weren't illegal. They weren't structured as anything but a private arrangement between two adults. But she raised one detail that none of us had considered. Our state's inheritance laws regarding biological children, which meant that if my father ever passed away without an updated, explicit will accounting for Wren by name, she would likely still be entitled to a share of the estate as a legal heir, will or no will, acknowledgement or no acknowledgement. Your mother may have believed that silence protected the estate, Miss Acaffer said carefully. In most cases, it does the opposite. Biological children generally retain inheritance rights regardless of whether a relationship was ever acknowledged. The secrecy didn't prevent a legal claim from existing. It just delayed anyone from understanding what that claim actually was. I watched my mother's face when I relayed this to her later, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, I saw something that looked less like defensiveness and more like genuine, uncomfortable recalculation. The realization that decades of careful management had never actually protected the outcome she thought she was protecting. It had only delayed the moment everyone would have to reckon with it honestly, and made that reckoning far more painful than it likely needed to be. Wren and I met in person for the first time about 4 months after her original message, at a small restaurant roughly halfway between our two states, both of us nervous in a way that made the drive there feel longer than it actually was. I recognized her instantly, which surprised me, not because we look identical, we don't, but because of small things, the shape of her hands, the way she held her menu a little too close while deciding what to order, gestures so specifically familiar they felt like looking at a slightly different version of myself. We talked for almost 4 hours. She told me more about her adoptive parents, wonderful people she clearly loved deeply, and I found myself relieved in a complicated way that she'd grown up cared for and steady, even without the answers she'd spent years wanting. I told her about growing up in the house she'd never gotten to see, about our father's quiet, steady presence, about the version of our family I'd believed in completely until 3 months earlier. I don't need your parents to love me, she said at one point carefully, like she'd thought about how to phrase it in advance. I've had parents who love me my whole life, I just wanted to know the truth. I think the not knowing was always harder than whatever the actual answer turned out to be. I understood that more than I expected to. I think, in a strange way, I'd been living a smaller version of the same thing, not knowing, without realizing there was anything to know, and finding that the truth, however complicated, was still easier to carry than the unknowing silence that had come before it. My father met Wren 3 weeks after that, alone at his request, in a quiet park near his house rather than anywhere that might feel too formal or too final. He told me about it afterward, sitting in his recliner, uncharacteristically talkative for a man who usually kept his feelings folded up small. She has my mother's eyes, he said. I noticed it the second she got out of the car, your grandmother's eyes exactly. He was quiet for a moment. I spent 30 years telling myself it was better for everyone if I just let your mother handle it. I think I convinced myself that made me a good husband. I don't think it made me a good father, not to her. Maybe not fully to you and Marcus either, if I'm honest, because a man who lets someone else decide what truth his children deserve isn't really protecting anyone. He's just avoiding the harder version of love. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation, not the kind you'd see staged for a camera. It was two people who'd missed 30 years sitting on a park bench, talking carefully, both of them a little too aware of how much time there was to make up for and how impossible it was to actually make up for all of it at once. But it was real, and it was a beginning, which was more than either of them had had a week earlier. My mother took the longest to come around, and I want to be honest that came around is a generous way of describing what actually happened, because I don't think she ever fully abandoned the belief that she'd been protecting something worth protecting. What did shift slowly over the better part of a year was smaller than a full apology, but not nothing. She agreed eventually to meet Wren once, a stiff, careful lunch that Marcus and I both attended, more as buffers than participants. She didn't apologize for the checks, or for intercepting Deborah's letters, or for the decade of managed silence. What she said instead, toward the end of that uncomfortable lunch, was the closest thing to honesty I think she was capable of in that moment. I don't know how to undo 30 years of decisions I still partly believe were right. I can't give you back the time you didn't have with your father. I can only tell you I'm sorry it cost you that, even if I still think I was trying to hold something together that mattered. Ren, gracious in a way I don't know I could have managed in her position, simply said, "Thank you for saying that much." It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was the beginning of a truce, which felt like enough for that particular afternoon. A year and a half after that first cereal bowl morning, Ren, Marcus, and I have something that didn't exist before any of this started, an actual relationship built slowly on our own terms, separate from whatever our parents did or didn't manage to repair between themselves. We have a group text that's mostly nonsense, the way sibling group texts usually are. We spent a long weekend together last spring, the three of us, at a lake house Marcus rented. And there's a photograph from that trip on my refrigerator now, the three of us squinting into the sun, that still catches me off guard sometimes with how normal it looks. How much like something that could have always existed if 30 years of decisions had gone differently. My relationship with my mother is quieter than it used to be, more careful, less automatic. I still love her. I don't think I'll ever fully trust her the same way again, and I've made peace with the fact that those two things can coexist without canceling each other out. My relationship with my father is, strangely, closer than it's ever been, not despite what happened, but because watching him finally choose honesty, even decades late, even imperfectly, taught me something about him I don't think I would have learned any other way. Deborah and I still talk occasionally. She never asked for anything from any of us beyond the acknowledgement she should have had access to 30 years ago, and I think that's the detail that stays with me most, out of everything, how small the original ask really was, and how much unnecessary pain an entire family absorbed trying to avoid giving it to her. I think about that morning over the kitchen sink more than I probably should, the notification I almost didn't check, the sister I almost never met because my own family had decided, decades before I was old enough to have an opinion about it, that some truths were too risky to hand over freely. I don't think my mother is a villain, not entirely. I think she's a woman who made a frightened decision 30 years ago and then spent 3 decades doubling down on it, layer after layer, because admitting the original decision was wrong felt harder than simply managing its consequences forever. I understand that impulse even as I hold her accountable for it. I think most of us, if we're honest, have some version of a wound we've chosen to manage instead of heal, because managing feels safer than facing what healing might actually cost. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's that secrets kept out of love still cost the people love was supposedly protecting. Ren didn't find me because she wanted to hurt anyone. She found me because she deserved to know where she came from, and the truth, however inconvenient, was always going to find its way to the surface eventually. It just took a DNA test, a file box in a garage, and a decade of canceled checks to finally get there. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflective purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. If it stayed with you, it's because so many of us carry family secrets we've never had the courage to ask about directly, and sometimes the truth, even the painful kind, is a lighter thing to carry than the silence we build to avoid it.